All right, so commutative, distributive, and estimative justice in Adam Smith. Adam Smith's fullest elaboration of commutative justice is this one from the Theory of Moral Sentiments. The most sacred laws of justice, he later calls this one commutative justice. Therefore, those whose violation seems to call loudest for vengeance and punishment are the laws which guard the life and person of our neighbor. The next are those which guard his property and possessions, and last of all come those which guard what are called his personal rights, or what is due to him from the promises of others. So person, property, contracted or consented rights due, promises due, a very robust and tangible and concrete idea of things that you are not to mess with of your neighbors, say, of others. Commutative justice is one of the virtues you are to practice, one of the virtues treated in the Theory of Moral Sentiment, and this is, like I say, the fullest, most concise description of it. What's with this word commutative? You might relate that to the word commuter. Like you drive, you commute in the morning from home to job, point to point. Likewise, think commutative, part to part. And that's in contrast to, say, part to whole, or whole to part, or even whole to whole. Commutative justice has a part to part flavor to it. Now, in the book, he gives the impression of suggesting that justice is simply commutative justice, and that you should confine your talk about justice to commutative justice. But actually, I see a double doctrine, if you will, in Smith. For he also, I think, goes on to show us that justice is not simply commutative justice, and that we should talk justice beyond this commutative idea of justice. So he gives the impression of the first doctrine, confine your talk about justice to commutative, but really he affirms doctrine 2. So hence there's a sort of double doctrine here. Evidence of this second doctrine is that he affirms the 3 senses of justice he presents, notably in what I have here called the Justices paragraph, which you have on your handout. And you can see where I've written AFF for affirmation. I see those as affirmations of the beyond commutative senses of justice. The other senses are distributive and estimative. He talks distributive explicitly here in this handout. As for the third one, he does not call it estimative, but he does describe this third sense of justice without giving it a particular name, and I call it estimative, which I think is fitting. So he affirms the 3 senses, and what's more, he himself pervasively talks justice beyond commutative. For example, here are 36 cases from his writings of talking distributive. Here are 57 cases of estimative in relations like between you and your neighbor, equal relations. And here are 12 cases of estimative in superior-inferior, governor-governed jural relations. So that's a lot of justice talk beyond commutative, right? He's clearly not, if he's preaching to us to confine your justice talk to commutative, well, gosh, he's violating his own teaching or preaching pervasively, so I don't think he's really telling us that. Instead, it's doctrine 2, which is to affirm all 3 senses of justice. And if you code the justice talk in the 2 major works, you see that a tremendous amount is beyond CJ, commutative justice, especially in TMS. Why would Smith generate this double doctrine? I don't want to try to address that maybe in the Q&A. I think it's a very interesting question, and I think I could suggest some answers. Maybe what I have to say will suggest some answers, but it is the right question to ask whenever you find a double doctrine. However, double doctrines, or contrarieties, as Donald Livingston likes to put it, are actually pervasive in Hume and Smith, very important ones. We're talking about justice today. The Treatise of Human Nature has a major contrariety on reason, a very famous matter. Both authors have interesting contrarieties, multiple senses of nature and natural. This is a honey in Smith and TMS, and in fact, Smith scholars have nothing like a consensus about this issue. And also I see contrarieties on these, particularly in Hume, perhaps. So the idea that there are double doctrines and contrarieties in esoteric writing really is a matter of course, as this great book by Arthur Melzer teaches us. Before 1800, esotericism was pretty much universal among great writers. So let's just step back a second and ask ourselves what we should think about justice and our usage of the word justice. Should we go beyond CJ at all? Perhaps we should have just one sense of justice and confine our justice talk to CJ. That's one option. Another is to say, no, there's more than CJ. After all, maybe you have to justify an allegiance to CJ. And surely CJ wouldn't be the justification for its own allegiance, right? You got to go to something bigger, as it were. So that leads people to think, no, there's got to be two senses of justice, a CJ and some, let's say, ZJ. And so we find people, in fact, moving from one to two senses of justice. And what would be a most common ZJ that people talk about? Often social. They see this commutative justice idea, and then they talk about social justice. Well, I'm here to propose that you need three senses, okay? And that actually getting into the two-sense system creates confusion and doesn't work out so well. And what we need to do, if you're starting here, which I think a lot of classical liberals and libertarians actually tend to do, is you got to jump from 1 to 3. That's kind of, I guess, maybe my counsel for today. And I'm trying to justify or explain why I think that. So let's start with commutative justice. If you look on here, you'll see at one point that he describes it as abstaining from what is another's, abstaining, not messing with what stuff is another's, other people's. So this formulation neatly parallels the one he gives right here in this paragraph. I like this formulation a bit better because it breaks down these three things a little more clearly. There's this whole question of stuff, that's property or promises due. And I should note, just for scholarly integrity and all, that in other passages he does also sometimes include reputation as covered by CJ. He seems to be equivocal about that. I don't think it really belongs there. I don't think it really fits in the logic of CJ. I'm going to diminish it in the remainder of my presentation, but just, you know, it is in some passages. So anyway, the stuff here is, like again here, person, property, and promises due, forgetting about reputation. And, you know, that depends, I mean, what it is that's going to count as someone's property or stuff is going to depend on historical norms and circumstances and so on. The issue of what makes it Jim's, let's say, rather than Susan's stuff, or Jim's rather than no one's stuff, like an unknown thing, like the stratosphere, Those things work out in history and context, and what exactly counts as messing with also depends on particularities of history and context, time and place. However, I do think that what we get in history in any society that survives or gets on is a sort of uniformity amongst this historical variety. There's a uniformity in the general formulation because however a community figures these three things, if they're not respecting that figuring, that is, if they are often messing with each other's stuff, they're just not going to get on in the world, right? They're not going to prosper, they're not going to invest, they're not going to grow, they're going to be at war with each other. And so this is almost like a natural convention among equals that must be observed for a society to get anywhere. Government in such societies can affect the fine points of these, but I don't think you should think that the government is somehow, totally defining what it is that constitutes or defines each of these three. I think it's more that they adjust certain natural conventions that are naturally emergent quite universally, even among equals without government. So commutative justice is one of the three senses of justice, and the three senses are shown in the table handout, on the one-page table handout, in the three columns. So the first column is commutative, and I'd like to dwell a little bit on commutative and its specialness. It's very special among all the virtues, and it plays special roles in the theory of moral sentiments. One of the special roles it plays is that, well, first of all, Smith presents the book as primarily about life among equals, you and your neighbor, you and your friends, you and your church members, you and your employees, you and your employer. Jural equals, okay? However, he does turn out from that and talk about the jural superior or governor. And he makes clear what he means by this sense of superior in this paragraph by varying terms. A superior, the laws, the civil magistrate, the sovereign, a lawgiver. And so he does mark out two sets of jural relationships in the book. Those among, like, you and your neighbor, jural equals, which I represent as EE, and the governor and the governed, the jural superior and inferior, which I represent as this SI. And this dualism of jural relationships is built into the formulation, okay, the kind of the system of thinking. And this is one of the roles that CJ plays, because essentially what defines this kind of relationship and what distinguishes it from this one is that here you have special players, the governor, who systematically violate commutative justice, who institutionalize the violation, the messing with other people's stuff. And they do it in a way very unlike criminals in this context do it. The criminals in this context sneak around at night, right, when you're not home. Whereas these guys, put up a website and say, this is what we're going to take from you. This is what we're going to threaten you with coercion for you doing voluntarily, like paying somebody less than $7 an hour or whatever. So this is a very special relationship, which in a sense depends on the very concept of commutative justice. Now, what about commutative justice itself, for example, among equals, you and your neighbor? How is it special among the virtues? The chief difference and specialness is that its rules, Smith teaches us, are precise and accurate, whereas the rules of all the other virtues are loose, vague, and indeterminate. He elaborates this, and he kind of says that they evolve to be precise and accurate. In fact, Hume articulates that more fully, that the rules of commutative justice have evolved in just this fashion. It's these precise and accurate rules which we adopt as the rules of CJ, making, if you will, a perfect right in an old jurisprudence terminology. And the other aspects of CJ's specialness flow quite directly from this special nature of its rules, precise and accurate. So I've got a list of 6 here altogether. The actions commutative justice treats are ones generally we are not to do, such that doing nothing or pure passiveness is often sufficient to fulfilling CJ. Think about it. If you just never get out of your bed in the morning and lay in bed all day, presumably you will have succeeded in not messing with other people's stuff, right? You won't have stolen anyone's car, you won't have broken anyone's windows or anything else. It's possible, though, that that day you had certain obligations to perform, contractual, consensual, like being at work, like repaying a loan, and so it's possible that you did, in fact, violate CJ by just staying in bed all day. But by and large, those contracted rights aside, doing nothing is sufficient. And, you know, again, it's formulated as not messing with other people's stuff. Something else that's special about it is that feedback on one's performance is only negative. You get feedback when you violate CJ, when you do mess with other people's stuff, and that feedback is negative. You know, you get criticized or smacked or even arrested, right? Maybe your neighbors chase after you and, you know, want their things back or want to punish you. But there's nothing positive in the feedback. That is to say, if you succeed in not messing with other people's stuff, you don't get a round of, way to go, you didn't mess with anyone's stuff today, you know, well done. No, this is like a very basic thing, and Smith gives this wonderful analogy, original to him as far as I can see, of these rules of conduct that we're talking about, like commutative justice, whose rules are precise and accurate, being like the rules of grammar. And the rules of grammar, too, have feedback beyond grammar school anyway. That's only negative. If you turn in a paper to your college course and there's any feedback on your grammar, it's only going to be negative feedback. You know, your professor's not going to say, hey, way to go, you know, you got your grammar right, you put a period, you know, you capitalized the first way to go. No, it's only negative in the same exact way. And that's in contrast to the other kinds of virtues whose rules are loose, vague, and indeterminate. In writing, those are rules, Smith says, which critics lay down for the attainment of what is sublime and elegant in writing. Those are not strict, precise, and accurate rules, right? We don't have any formula, strict formula, precise and accurate rules for a good story, a good poem, a good movie, a good pop song, a good symphony. It's aesthetic, right? So there's kind of a move here from the grammar to the aesthetic. And it's maybe more of a continuum in some ways, but you know, there's still the basic distinction. And CJ, again, is special in that its rules are precise and accurate, whereas all the other virtues, which do correspond to the other justices, are loose, vague, and indeterminate. And feedback on those is both negative and positive. See, here the red line is CJ. That's a very straight, solid line. Kind of everyone in the community kind of will agree whether or not you messed with someone's stuff. But on the other virtues, hospitality, generosity, temperance, charity, whatever, those rules are loose, vague, and indeterminate. That's this waviness. And then we develop a sense of a band of okay. That's okay, what he's done. And Smith calls that propriety. And above propriety is praiseworthy, below blameworthy. So there's not only negative, there's also positive for all the other virtues, whereas for CJ, it's only negative. Okay? And by the way, these are marked with J's for community J, because these senses of the proper rules and the okay region vary with, you know, the community. It's a little bit like sports, like high school baseball is different than Major League Baseball, right? And someone who's outstanding and up here and praiseworthy in high school baseball, well, in professional baseball, the okay would be up here and he might be actually a bum, right? Okay, going on the list of the specialness of commutative justice, an observance of the rules in equal-equal relationships is indispensable because, as we said, if neighbors are regularly messing with each other's stuff, that society's not going anywhere. Again, this is so this means that this kind of CJ is like a natural convention in any society that gets anywhere. Next, in equal-equal relationships, we feel a stricter obligation to observe commutative justice than other virtues. Like if someone isn't a good host, say we're talking about hospitality as one of those other virtues, like we might be kind of down on them and roll our eyes and talk about it afterwards, but we don't actually feel that we can punish him and so on that we do when someone violates CJ. When someone really messes with your stuff, like suppose someone took something from someone's house, we would feel a stricter obligation about that. We'd get more exercised about it, and we may even feel that rectification could be forced, which we don't feel about like hospitality and other things. And then finally, by virtue of the precise and accurate nature of the rules of this, again, this is the virtue, don't mess with other people's stuff. You can flip it around to the concept of others not messing with your stuff. And the term Smith uses for that in EE relationships is security, like home security, right? Security against criminals. They are jural equals who are trying to mess with your stuff. And in the superior-inferior relationship, liberty, or sometimes natural liberty, okay? So liberty is basically the government not messing with your stuff. That's not to say he considers that to be an absolute rule for desirability, for ethics. It's just a definition, okay? And it has CJ built into it because it's working with the flip side of CJ. And we see this flip side relationship in Smith's text. He talks about two interventions he doesn't like. He says both were evident violations of natural liberty and therefore unjust. That is, therefore commutatively unjust. Okay. So that's what cell A1 is about. Now let's move on to cell B1, distributive justice. Smith, again, you can look at the paragraph on the next page, but I don't want to get into the text now. He defines it as the becoming use of what is our own. So Jim is the actor. We're talking about Jim's distributive justice, or we're judging the justice of Jim's actions in this way. And it's about Jim making a becoming use of what is Jim's own. Now this already is very different than CJ. Well, immediately in the sense that what the own that matters here is Jim's own, whereas with CJ, it was the other people's own. It was about not messing with other people's own, or suum in the Latin expression, which goes all the way, which is in Grotius and others that, you know, provided the groundwork for this stuff. Also, you can see right here, it's about a becoming use, obviously aesthetic, loose, vague, and indeterminate, not grammatical, not precise and accurate. So it's quite different. He also describes it as proper beneficence. And he also makes clear, if you look at this passage here, that it's done to persons. and in particular persons you are connected to. Now, admittedly, that idea of connectedness does thin out and does become abstract, and the persons to whom distributive justice is done can become unidentifiable and abstract, but the idea is that it is done to persons, and particularly beginning with people you are really connected to. So that's DJ. Here's one example of meaning DJ when he speaks of justice. This is right in the invisible hand paragraph in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, but I won't go into the details. It's a quite notable case of DJ. Okay, on to the third, cell C in the handout, and that's estimative justice. The idea here is that it's about estimating objects properly. Jim's action now, it's not whether he messes, it's not how he distributes his resources, it's how he estimates an object. Maybe it's good for us to look at the text here in the justices paragraph, and you can see here where I have EJ. See, after he has spoken of CJ and DJ, he goes on to a third. He says, there is yet another sense in which the word justice is sometimes taken, still more extensive than either of the former, still more extensive than either of the former, though very much akin to the last, that's DJ, and which runs too, so far as I know, through all languages. It is in this last sense that we are said to be unjust when we do not seem to value any particular object with that degree of esteem, or to pursue it with that degree of ardor, which to the impartial spectator it may appear to deserve or to be naturally fitted for exciting. Thus we are said to do injustice to a poem or a picture when we do not admire them enough, and we are said to do them more than justice when we admire them too much. So he gives the example of a poem or a picture. You might think of those as external objects. Jim estimates the picture on the wall. And then, as it were, the estimative jurisprude, if you will, judges Jim's estimative justice of the picture, the object, under estimation. So that's the logic of EJ. There's an object, there's an estimator, and then there's a sense of, was the estimation by that estimator just? That's the logic. And if you go on in this paragraph, he says here, to continue, in the same manner we are said to do injustice to ourselves when we appear not to give sufficient attention to any particular object of self-interest. So he turns inward and looks at objects, as it were, of ourselves, of our selfhood, of our existence, perhaps. That could be our motives, our beliefs, our sentiments, our commitments, our relationships, our plans, all these different things about ourselves. Those can be treated as objects. So don't think of objects here as just like, external objects you can hold in your hand. Anything that we kind of take consciousness of, right, is an object for estimation. In fact, I'd say that in Smith, as soon as we have an object in our consciousness of any sort, we are immediately developing sentiments about it of this EJ nature, right? We're like actually enmeshed within EJ as we go along, as though stuff's happening behind the scenes as far as we're concerned. And in fact, as soon as you estimate an object, let's say you estimate an object like a picture on the wall, you can turn around a moment later and take that estimation and make that your object, so that the estimation of the picture on the wall then becomes an object of estimation, right? So you can say Jim had a, what time is it right now? 12:37, estimation of the picture. And then at 12:38, Jim can estimate his 12:37 estimation of the picture. And so you get this diachronic sense moving through time, diachronic, of EJ working on itself because it creates its own objects. Every conversation is like constantly creating, bringing into your consciousness new objects, and you're doing EJ, you're doing estimation, and you're also doing EJ because you're your own estimative jurisprudent all the time. And let me say that this is a very basic operation, really, this estimating and this question of the justice of your estimation. And each estimation, or even the issue of the justice of it, is really only as grand as the object estimated. Like, let's say it's 1787, and they just came out of Philadelphia with the proposed Constitution, and we're to estimate it. Well, that's a pretty big object, right? And they had a big, vibrant discourse about that. They ended up ratifying it, right? So that's a very grand matter of EJ. How about the presumption of liberty that you should sort of feel, or perhaps you should feel? That's kind of what the issue is. How strongly should you feel this kind of presumption of liberty? I'd say that's a pretty grand. Okay, then there's something simpler, like, for example, Klein's interpretation of justice, like you're hearing right now. Not so grand. And I hope you estimate justly. And then there's my chewing gum, which I neglected to bring with me this morning, and I decided not to go back for. Right? I estimated that. Maybe I misestimated its importance. Maybe I didn't estimate it justly, but it's only chewing gum, so let's not even bother with that. The point is that estimate of justice is this very basic operation, and it's only kind of going to be as important as the object estimated, basically. And it's extremely complex. This is key for the whole liberalism element in all this. Some things to consider. Conceptions, it must involve conceptions of the good of larger wholes. In some sense, you're developing your whole belief system or outlook on the responsibility of serving universal benevolence. No one particular person that you're connected to, but some much, almost like to God, okay? So some much larger conceptions of the good of larger wholes are involved in the justice issue here. And that involves beliefs about how that good is served, conceptions of the good of one's smaller parts that maybe you're more in touch with and have more local knowledge of, beliefs about how that good is served, relations between the larger and the smaller. And then there's all these matters when we actually converse or write about strategic discourse, esotericism, deceit. And then there's issues of confusing yourself, self-deceit, as Smith puts it, groupthink, faction, fanaticism, false notions of religion, the path dependence of the self. This gets very, very difficult, and we're all going to be unique and develop our own thoughts about EJ, especially on the bigger objects for estimation. It's very loose, vague, and indeterminate here. And you'll notice that for CJ, where the rules are precise and accurate, the types of expressions are often very literal, even tangible, whereas the types of expressions for this become very figurative, as we see very clearly in TMS, where he talks about the man within the breast, the impartial spectator, and so on. You get allegory and such here. And this corresponds also to the knowledge problems involved. These are relatively simple. That's the beauty of the social grammar. That's why it's social grammar. And these are very complex and difficult. And again, we're going to disagree about. So if you think of this whole space as like points in it as instances of conduct, let's say Jim's conduct, the point of this graph is that it shows that there's these three different lenses, three different ways of thinking justice that you can perhaps take to any point in this space. And the idea here is that there's this nested relationship such that any issue where CJ is an interesting question is nested within DJ, and everything is nested within operations of EJ. So let's say, as a matter of CJ, we ask about some of my conduct. Let's say I run out into the street and steal a car. Have I messed with someone's stuff? We ask the CJ question. Yes, I have. I've stolen the guy's car. But notice that any time you have a CJ issue of messing, or Jim messing or not messing, he is making some use of his own stuff. His time, his body, his person, and so on. His energy. And so you can always ask the DJ question about that same, so that's always inside of DJ. Did Dan make a becoming use of his own, that's the DJ question, when he stole the car? Well, it's possible, right? Maybe my daughter was choking to death or having some breakdown or, thing, and I had to rush her to the hospital. And it could be that it was actually a becoming use of my own to steal the car, okay? In which case, in that case, I should actually violate commutative justice. Rare, very rare, but there are very special cases where even the social grammar can be excused, even though you should be still legally held responsible for compensation and so on. And then any kind of conduct rolls back to questions of the objects involved in that conduct, the objects involved in the whole consciousness of that conduct, and then how the person apparently is estimating those objects. So really it's like we're inside this whale of EJ that we're never even outside of, really, because it's like I said, consciousness is already doing EJ as soon as we have consciousness. And then inside the whale of EJ, we perceive this kind of vaguely formed DJ, and then this much more robustly formed CJ that we use as a social grammar. Okay. Now, let me move on here to the next row in the column. These are different actors. And the next row is actually, again, an equal in a kind of equal relationship, but it's a special sort of equal. It's the government sector equal. Like, let's say the university, like George Mason University, or if you like, the administrator, the provost of the university. What do we make of him? Well, I propose that we see him as a kind of equal, and that essentially it's the same kind of logic as in the first row. That is to say, he may not own the university, the provost. Who does own the university? I don't know, we're going to say the residents of Virginia? Let's say that. But still, he's their agent. Just like in a private company, we have the managers who are the agent and do stuff. And we can ask whether they are, first of all, violating people's stuff, whether they happen to be sneaking off at night and stealing something, or who knows what. I don't suppose that our provost is doing that much. And then we can ask whether or not he, as sort of like a representative or agent of the set of owners, is making a becoming use of their own. Is he making a becoming use of George Mason University resources? And we'll have different issues and public administration issues there. It is a different kind of ownership. Obviously, some of these government actors are huge actors with a lot of influence and sway in society, but I still think of them basically as another sort of equal. Also, the fact that GMU subsists in part on tax money, I kind of see that in separation to some extent here in this analysis in this row. It's as though that tax money kind of comes into the coffers of GMU. Now it's GMU's resources, and we proceed with this kind of analysis. All right, that row is there in a way to help us clarify the next row, right? To separate what we just talked about, the provost and so on, who is not a jural superior, from now the jural superior. And this is the guy that actually makes rules that can, violate CJ, institutionalized violations of CJ, and for that matter, undo violations, governmental violations of CJ, like, say, repealing the minimum wage law, for example, changing the tax code, and so on, changing immigration rules, and so on. Any of the 10,000 commandments that we live under. And so that's the jural superior proper, okay? And what I propose here is that DJ does not apply to the jural superior. That is to say, qua jural superior, the actor owns nothing. It's almost like a disembodied spirit in a way. Like even Donald Trump, the President of the United States, like if we see him signing the tax bill, the new tax law, if we want to think of him as doing something in distributive justice, we have to see him in the government as equal role. That is to say, an administrator who is appointed by the owners of the government, okay, which I guess is the residents, the citizens of the United States or whatever, who is to, use pens to sign paperwork, and as an equal is actually doing this as an equal. But in deciding what he's going to sign, right, and deciding, that this bill deserves passage, I propose that we see that in terms of CJ and EJ only. So that is to say, we can ask, whether or not this action violates people's stuff or increases or decreases the violations of people's stuff. Sometimes it's not really clear how you do that kind of overall assessment, but still you can kind of try to track the CJ issues involved in the matter. And then, more importantly, you think of this as an object, this reform, this new policy. Is this an object that deserves approval, that deserves support? And it's really, policy discourse is really EJ, apart from the CJ questions, which do matter, of course, but the ultimate desirability questions are EJ questions. Like take the case of selling, the law against selling your kidney. When that was passed, I think it was in the 90s, if I remember right. I'm not sure, actually, what the situation was up till then. But I think the latest law is from the 90s, if I'm not mistaken. Clearly, that law violates CJ, because if you wanted to sell me your kidney, like you're not messing with anyone's stuff, I'm not messing with anyone's stuff, and there's a gun being pointed, I guess, in the buyer's face. I'm not quite sure who they point the gun at, maybe both of us or maybe just one of us. Then there's the question of, is it a good law? Because, despite violating liberty, it could be a good law. And Smith makes this very clear because he does make exceptions to liberty. And that would be EJ. Is this law an object worthy of support and promotion? Okay. And we see this in Smith. In fact, he even in talking about his maxims of taxation, which he clearly sees as a matter of coercion, he talks about the justice of certain maxims for taxing people, right? So there must be a justice here beyond CJ, and I think it's clearly EJ. So we have this stuff of CJ, life, liberty, and then we have the kind of responsibility to make a becoming use of our own stuff and to judge objects justly, to pursue happiness. Okay? Now, I want to make another distinction between calling loudly and proffering coolly. If we go back to the original commutative justice passage, we'll notice call loudly. those whose violation seems to call loudest. And he uses this kind of terminology in a few spots in connection with CJ. So this gets into the matter of how we talk justice. I've been talking about whether we talk beyond CJ. What about how we talk about justice? And sometimes Smith does call loudly in The Wealth of Nations. He points out some interventions like the Settlement Acts and so on that he objects to that violate liberty, and he calls loudly. He like pounds the table. In other cases, though, including some cases that are clearly about EJ rather than CJ, like this, it's proffering coolly, if you will. It's a different kind of voice. And so what we get from Smith is that here again, he talks about possible tax support of certain things, and he puts it very coolly, without any injustice, possibly without injustice. He never calls loudly for matters of DJ and EJ, okay? And so he, in matters of justice here, we see that when you're beyond CJ, okay, these are beyond CJ, but beyond precise and accurate matters, he only allows himself to proffer coolly in matters of justice. Now you might ask, okay, well, you know, duties have the correlation to rights or liberty. And you might expect a kind of symmetry here, such that he would be in one of these two boxes. But in fact, Smith doesn't even talk liberty beyond the precise and accurate. Basically, never at all. And that creates an interesting asymmetry here, where he allows himself to talk about justice beyond the precise and accurate, and he allows himself to proffer coolly about that. But when it comes to liberty, he doesn't even allow himself to go beyond the precise and accurate. And that is an interesting asymmetry. Why is it that he doesn't even want liberty to go beyond there, or rights to go beyond there, this kind of rights, or talk of rights? And I think it's got to do with wanting to be able to talk about our duties, right? Because remember, the justice is a virtue you are to practice. It's a duty you are to show your neighbor. And he wants to enrich this discussion of duties, to impress duties upon people. He doesn't want to arm people too much with this language of rights and liberty beyond the precise and accurate, because people have a tendency to assert their rights and ignore their duties. And so that asymmetry, I think, kind of accounts for the asymmetry we see in Smith's discourse here. All right, now let me say a little bit about why we need three. So you might think, oh, we really only need two because we can assimilate EJ to DJ. We can see EJ as a kind of distributive justice. And I don't think so. I really do think it's a separate logic. It's related, but it's separate. For DJ, you know, that's like you making a becoming use of your own stuff, your wealth, your time, your social capital, and so on, with the people that you're connected to and your concerns. This doesn't quite have that logic. There's no clear stock of esteem points for you to distribute, right? I mean, you can go around saying everything's great. It just doesn't have the same kind of concreteness that you get in DJ. No clear stock of esteem points. No clear set of objects over which one is to distribute esteem points. It's too open. In fact, we saw that as soon as you do an EJ, you create a new object for estimation. So it just doesn't fit the logic so well. And furthermore, the whole logic of correlative rights and duties doesn't work well at all. Does the picture on the wall have a right to be estimated justly? No. I mean, you might say, Colin, that as a student or a friend, you have certain imperfect rights by DJ from me, right? And we might say like, I treated you wrongly or something. Not CJ, but just something DJ. And I've kind of violated some imperfect rights. But EJ, I mean, an object on the wall, suppose I like diss that, you know, or the landscape. I diss the landscape. Like, am I violating the landscape's rights? I mean, so it's got to quite, I do think that these two are definitely highly related. They're both loose, vague, and indeterminate. I think that ultimately they're both about serving universal benevolence. But the logics are different enough that we need to see the difference, okay? And so we need to jump from 1 again to 3, as I said before. If you try to take the two and mush them into some ZJ, you're going to not have. So a little bit now just about this whole theory and liberalism. First of all 3 are about an actor and his or her actions. You know, sometimes we hear people point to homeless people living under a bridge, and they say, see that? That's unjust. That's unjust. People living under a bridge. And it's like, okay, who's the actor? What's the action? Like, it's not even getting off the ground, right? Whereas all of these justices are about specifying an actor and an action. Okay, it's messing with someone's stuff or not, it's distributing your stuff in a becoming way, and it's estimating an object justly. So it pins things down better, all 3 of them. The 3J theory accentuates the specialness of CJ, as I have today. It highlights CJ as a social grammar for equal relationships and a presumption of liberty as a focal point in politics, or SI relationships. Distributive justice also demands who is the actor, what is his stuff. It makes you ask, what does Jim own? The ownership of the stuff for distribution is central in the 3J theory. To whom does he have duties? Okay, EJ demands also, who is the actor? What is the object of estimation? So often when we have policy disputes, a lot of the problem arises just from the fact that we haven't clearly articulated what reform we're talking about, or even what status quo we're reforming. So this kind of forces us to get concrete, and I think concreteness always serves liberalism, because it helps to expose the junkiness of a lot of illiberal ideas. Finally, the 3J theory teaches that DJ and EJ are loose, vague, and indeterminate, and that we will disagree on the higher things. And just like coming out of the wars of religion, we'd better lay off and try to get government to focus on the lower things, the stuff that we hope people aren't messing with, including the government. And again, it tells us to proffer coolly. When we talk politics, which is mainly about estimating different policies, proffer coolly. Don't scream, right? And so the more that you governmentalize life, the more you're going to turn it into politics, and the more you're going to have screaming, calling loudly, just by the nature of politics. So the whole 3J theory really fits the liberal outlook. Smith affirmed and practiced justice talk beyond commutative. Nonetheless, that is very special, and it plays special roles in his work. It's special among the virtues. By and large, it alone ever warrants calling loudly. Its flip side, liberty, is central to Smith. Even in political matters, Smith maintains a presumption of liberty. And the overall punchline here is that Smith's teachings and example guide us on how to talk justice beyond commutative. Formulate it as either distributive or estimative, not an admixture of the two, and proffer it coolly. I still haven't addressed directly this double doctrine question. We can maybe get into that, but thank you very much for your attention.